Hey folks, it's Muck You, the American Muckrakers podcast, where we sling mud at the high and mighty. I'm David Wheeler, the clown who kicked off this circus, joined by my co-founder and co-host, Colonel Mo Davis, a guy so tough he penned Sovereign Oak, a book you can snag on Amazon if you're into excellent literature. With an introduction of our special guest today, take it away, Mo.
Well, thanks, David, and good to be back with everyone. And if you're here in Western North Carolina, we're enjoying some really nice spring weather. So, we've got another great guest today, Mark McKinnon. Been a political advisor on a number of campaigns, including George Bush's successful campaign back in 2000, John McCain, Ann Richards. One of my favorite things he did was I was a big fan of the show, The Circus, that particularly with when Mark was on with John Heilman and Alex Wagner. It was a show kind of behind the scenes of politics, the good and the bad. He was an advisor on the HBO show, The Newsroom, on House of Cards, which I remember watching House of Cards thinking a president can't be this corrupt. And then all of a sudden we've got one that kind of made Kevin Spacey look tame. He's a co-founder of No Labels, an organization trying to return some common sense to politics and get the money and the parties kind of out of the way. And they're kind of a co-sponsor for the Problem Solver Caucus in Congress, which it seems like our current Congress is more of a problem creators than solvers. And he's a regular writer on Vanity Fair. So, Mark, we really appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
Always glad to join fellow prisoners of hope.
Hey, listen, I got to start by asking, my dad was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II, and he was a big LBJ fan. So when I was growing up in the closet, when you came in our house, there were 3 or 4 LBJ Stetson hats sitting on the rack there, and my dad didn't leave the house without one. And when I think of you, Stephen Jobs had the black turtleneck, and Paul Simon had the bow ties. When I think of you, it's the Stetson hats. How did that come about?
Well, Mo, thanks. Your shout out it ties right back to how the hat started. I say it's an affectation, admittedly, but it's just not a recent one. I've always worn hats, and there's not a picture of me growing up that I don't have a hat on. So I've always been the cat in the hat, but my dad also had, this is the open road Stetson. It's called the president's hat because of LBJ and other presidents, but most prominently LBJ wore this hat. It's kind of the gentleman's Western hat. And my dad was a rancher for a while, and he had one in his closet. And, little boys, wander into dad's closets, and there's all kinds of cool stuff in there, and you rummage around. But the coolest thing by far to me was that Stetson on the upper shelf, and I used to, ogle it, and I couldn't wait until I was old enough to get my own, and finally I did. And what I love about it is that it goes so far back, and yet it's had this huge renaissance. Now it's you see all the Brooklyn hipsters wearing them, and so we're making hats great again.
All right. Hey, well, listen, I got to ask, just recently you attended there in Austin, the 25th anniversary reunion for the George Bush back in 2000, the election there. And I saw your article you wrote. I think you said about 225 of the alumni came back for the reunion. I'm interested because, we've gone from Bush and what was known as compassionate conservatism to Trump and what can be termed cruelty and chaos. So what was it like at the reunion, and how did we get from those days to where we are now?
Yeah, it's incredible. It was really bittersweet. I mean, sweet because, the turnout was incredible. Almost every single person from that campaign showed up. And so it was a great reunion. And it was also, we got to have the celebration that we never had, because remember, there was a recount, so we weren't ever all together where we got to jump up and high five each other. It was, spread out over a couple of months, and everybody was scattered across the country in Florida and Washington. So we never got that celebratory moment. So this served to be that time when we all got to kind of give a big hug and a high five. But it was bitter because it was a celebration of all we created, but it was bitter in the sense of all that we've lost since then. And as you pointed out, what attracted me to George W. Bush as a former Democrat who'd worked for Ann Richards was this idea of compassionate conservatism. And there is zero compassion in the current administration. Also, you could argue not a lot of conservatism either. I mean, it's those. I was a radical free trader. That's part of why I joined the Republican Party too, and standing up to authoritarian governments. And just look at all that Trump is doing now, dismantling so much of what George Bush and other office holders had built. Things like the PEPFAR program, which saved 26 million lives around the world. So it's really disheartening. By the way, I recall I meant to put this in the article and I forgot. But the whole theme of our campaign, most of the ads, the tagline was we are running to restore honor and dignity to the White House. And I think about that idea now, the notion of honor and dignity. And anytime you're around Bush world, you just hear words like honor, decency, character, compassion, and there's just none of that now. And it's really it's very sad to see what's happening for all the country. But what's happened to the Republican Party. I mean, John McCain or George Bush couldn't get elected in a primary now, and I mentioned those names around MAGA Trump people, and they just sneer at me. As if they were the worst people ever on the planet. And they, whatever you think about their politics, John McCain and George Bush were incredible human beings and patriots.
Yeah, it is just mind-boggling. The world that we're living in right now. I had a op-ed in our local Asheville paper over the weekend talking about Signalgate. Having all these senior officials in the Trump administration exchanging, attack plans. Unfortunately, I guess, sharing it with the journalists so that we all found out about it, but no accountability, no standards. We hold 18-year-old recruits that are showing up in Texas for basic training to a higher standard than we hold the commander in chief and the secretary of defense. And that's just hard to figure how we got here.
Well, the hypocrisy is appalling. I mean, can you imagine if that had been somebody in the Biden administration, what Republicans would have done? I mean, it's just, and as you said, it's the sort of infraction that, not only shouldn't be happening at the highest government levels, it shouldn't be happening anywhere at any time. And if you were a, Marine recruit doing that sort of thing, you'd be busted out on your ass in 24 hours, right?
Yeah. But apparently, if you're at the top of the pyramid, remember in the old days, the buck stops here is always at the top. And now it's past the buck and no one's ever responsible.
Part of the issue, I think, guys, is that there's a culture in Trump world that I've observed. And this is, again, we were Team Bush was, we thought of ourselves as rule makers, and these guys think of themselves as rule breakers. And you have to kind of go back to the 2016 campaign, and if you work in politics, Wheeler, this, if you really want to, make your stripes, you go work on a presidential campaign, and if you're really lucky, you get the brass ring, and that's a career maker for you if that happens. And so, if you're working in politics, you try and get on a presidential campaign ultimately. And in 2016, I saw lots of people that I knew or were familiar with go around to the campaigns and interview. And if you ended up with Donald Trump, that was your 18th interview. You'd already been turned down 17 times because nobody thought Donald Trump was going to win, including Donald Trump, by the way. So you went to Bush, you went to Rubio. I mean, there was, it was a pretty all-star cast of legitimate candidates. And so so you can imagine the caliber of people who got turned down 18 times and then got hired. Now, admittedly, he's got a little more experienced and tested crew this time around, but it's still the code of conduct in Trump world is to, who can be the most outrageous, who can feed the outrage machine, who can break more stuff. So, the incentives are just so upside down. If you worked for Reagan or Obama or, any other president, you got points or credits for doing the right thing, for, building something. And in this administration, you get points for being, Laura Loomer. You get points for just being the most outrageous, the most, rule breaking. So you kind of play that out, and you get to a point where, the rule breaking is law breaking. They're breaking laws and they're breaking norms, and it's just an incredible race to the very bottom. They're digging holes as deep as they can, and so I just think that that's ultimately got a really bad ending. That's manifesting itself in the sort of behaviors that we've seen over the last couple of weeks.
Right. And Mark, you contrast with you jumping off one of your idols' campaigns because you didn't want to run against Obama.
Yeah.
Can you imagine in this environment anybody doing that ever?
Oh no, I mean, I would have been accused of being such a wimp, so soft, so woke.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, the idea was, that I had worked for McCain, I loved him, and I'd made this agreement with him that I said, listen, if you win the primary and Obama wins the primary, I'd met Obama, I liked him, I disagreed with his politics, but I thought his candidacy would be good for the country, and I just know how presidential campaigns go, and I knew that if they both won, that I'd be the tip of the spear attacking Obama, and I wouldn't be a good attack dog. I'd have a soft trigger finger. And I said, McCain, if this happens, then I should probably step out. And he said, yeah, right, McKinnon. I mean, the notion, this is early 2017, so the notion of Obama winning was so remote that McCain he just ignored it. And knowing that he'd do that, I wrote a memo to the senior staff, sort of outlining the agreement, which I knew would hold my feet to the fire too, because I knew it'd be hard to walk away after, campaigns of blood, sweat, and tears and band of brothers and sisters. So sure enough, it was really hard for me to do that, but I felt like I needed to honor the pledge. And sure enough, McCain had forgotten, and I held up the memo, and he he did the usual, God damn it, McKinnon. but he gave me a big hug, and he said, man, it'd be totally un-McCain like to not keep your word and your honor and your pledge. So, thanks for helping me get here, and God bless you. So, that was just it, but such a different world.
Yeah, completely different world. And clearly he hadn't seen my work advancing Obama's announcement in Iowa in early 2007. Otherwise,
exactly right.
He wouldn't have never let you write that letter. But
that's right. Good work.
So listen, Mark, that statement you made then, and that was really my first kind of when you popped up on my radar. It just says so much about you and about the integrity that you walk. You walk the walk and talk the talk every day. And I'm just interested in, where does that come from for you? I mean, obviously politics is a game of insights. It's also luck. And loyalty and a little bit of smarts. Where did all that political acumen and knowledge come from, Mark?
Well, as LBJ said, you're pissing on my leg, but it's warm and it feels good. But before I try and answer that, and thank you for those compliments, but just one other sidebar about that McCain thing, just to talk about class acts. I got a note from Obama after that happened, back in the days when he could still text or email. I guess he emailed me, and he said, "Hey, McKinnon, this is right after that what was announced." He said, "McKinnon, I can't believe you're doing this. It's such an honorable thing to do." But he said, and this was very insightful of him because it was true. He said, "But listen, I know you're walking away from a lot of money," and I was. And he said, "So listen, if you change your mind, I'll totally understand, and no harm done." And I just thought that was,
Wow.
that said a whole lot about Obama. Uh, can I tell you another quick Obama story?
Yes, please.
Just because, I mean, you're talking about, the character of people, right? And really the core of this is that over time I discovered that, if you have a checklist of 7 out of 10 things you want to agree with somebody on, and that should be your candidate, that doesn't always work out because they're not, sometimes they're not just good people. They may have, agree with you on a bunch of stuff, but they don't have that fundamental character thing. So that's what became really important to me. Um, my daughter, when she was about 20 years old, had a couple of a series of really tragic things happen to her. Her boyfriend was killed in a boating accident. Then her best friend and roommate was killed in a car wreck, which was really a tough deal. Would be for anybody at 20 years old when you have the world ahead of you. But I know David Axelrod really well, and he and I are just good friends, and we share a lot of personal stories. And he's told me stories about struggles with his family, and same with me. So I shared that with Axelrod, and then this happened to be in 2007, 2008, and 3 months later, in the middle of the campaign, in the very heat of the campaign, my daughter gets this 2 or 3 page note from Michelle Obama, and it starts off, "Dear," my daughter's name, "you don't know me. My name's Michelle Obama. And I heard about, what you've been going through. And I just want to tell you, when I was, about your age, I lost my best friend and my father within just, a couple of weeks or a couple of months of each other. And I thought the world was going to end. And I'm sure that's how you feel. And I'm just here to tell you it's not. You're going to make it." So that's all you had to tell me about the Obamas. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, my experience, Mark, was in February 2007. We did his announcement through Iowa. You remember Springfield, Illinois, and then he came up to Cedar Rapids and Waterloo, and I was the lead guy for Waterloo, and it had snowed the day before. They cleared the snow from the school parking lot, but the snow was piled up on the sides of the road, which screwed up parking. So people literally parked their cars up on these snowbanks. And so George Caudill was with us. I don't know if you know George.
George.
Yeah. George was the lead guy on the bus, and he kept
man.
calling me, "Wheeler, where are you? We can't get up. The bus can't get up there." And so I thought, "Oh fuck, I'm screwed." And because candidates. Yeah. And then so I bounded up on the bus after I ran down to the bottom of the parking lot to find him. And I was just distraught. I'm like, "Holy shit, this is," David Yepsen was on the bus. So Des Moines Register reporter, and
taking notes.
Okay,
yeah.
his headline's gonna be, "Can't even get the bus to the door. How can we get him to the White House?"
End of Wheeler's career. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Literally. I mean, it was flashed before my eyes, and it wasn't really about me. It was about the campaign, and I bounded up, and he was right there, and he said. He looked at me, and he could tell I was a little distressed. He kind of looked around the bus. He could see that people were a little pissed. And he said, "Listen, wow, you packed him in here, Wheeler. This is fantastic. Grab Michelle's arm. Let's go scooting across the ice." And in that moment, and I've told this story on the pod before, but in that moment, it just deflated everything. And then nobody could come after me.
Yeah. You're bulletproof.
Yeah. And I mean, can you imagine that? Imagine what would have happened if it would have been another candidate. My ass on the ice after this event, but
you'd been fired for having a bad sound system.
Yeah, and then we rewarded him later on. I had let the food service company know that Obama was coming, and they flew in their chef from Philadelphia. And Obama, I swear to God, this is a true story. I said. After the event was over, I said, "We got to put you in a hold for a little bit, because the same thing on the way out. We can't get the bus up here. We're going to let the lot clear out a little bit." He says, "Oh, fine, great." I said, "You want something to eat?" And he said, "Well, David," and he looked straight in my eyes. He said, "I'd really like some pasta. And if you had some not manicotti, but a different kind of pasta." So I said, "Okay, we'll get it." And I figured we'd just call it out to a restaurant. Well, the chef was Italian. Philadelphia, brought his spices, brought his pasta, and we served up Michelle and Barack. And he turned to me, he says, Wheeler, I was just kidding.
Oh, that's amazing. That's a great story.
So every time I would see him after that, he said, hey, Mr. Pasta, can I get some masticholi? And
Pasta man.
yeah, exactly.
I
So
love it. It's great.
yeah,
Well,
it's just a different time.
yeah, like I said, I'm lucky and grateful, and just I've always kind of stumbled into stuff mostly by accident, and but like I said, for reasons I don't, a big part of just how I was raised. It just ultimately I came to believe that character counts and really matters. And I guess the other thing I'll just say that is probably more of a flaw in life, but it's a flaw I'll gladly accept in terms of the reverse. I sort of have an extra empathy chromosome. I really feel people's pain. I mean, put me in a room and I'll just, the first thing I'll think of is, the waiter in the back, who's having to serve everybody. And it's just, or I'm in a hotel, I think about the maid service person who's out eating a sandwich in the hallway, or, it's just a place that I always go to naturally. And it's something, by the way, that this strikes me about our current commander in chief, that not only does he not have an excess, and I don't think he has an empathy chromosome at all. I think if he saw a kid hit by a car, he'd start waxing on about what kind of car it was.
Or how it was a kid's fault. Yeah.
Yeah, whatever. Anyway, and I think that there's lots of interesting kind of studies and thoughts about empathy, and but I just think that ultimately, if we're not thinking a little bit about people in our community who are, the whole idea is to serve others. I mean, that's what McCain was all about, to serve a cause greater than yourself. And so that's kind of a bottom line on where, I think, but, we're getting to a point now where Republicans have run against government for so long, and now it's just they're on the crazy train, and they're just like, now they've caught the car, but it's like, Colonel was talking about FEMA, and they're just eliminating all these things that actually do stuff. And I think, it's going to be a big wake up call for a lot of people who, go to national parks now, and the toilets aren't clean, just because they thought it was, that we don't need that stuff.
Yeah. And I'm up in Western North Carolina, not today, but normally. And, we got hit by Helene very hard in my small town. And there was a guy out last week surveying for debris removal. They're going to come into the backyards of folks and actually remove stumps and trees and stuff. Well, that money, I think, has just dried up. And these are all Trumpers out here. So it'll be really interesting to see what my neighbors say about Trump when their stumps don't get removed. But yeah. So let's move on to happier times. Now, back in history, but tell us one of your favorite Ann Richards story. What an amazing human being she was.
Wow. Well, I mean, she was. I mean, you think about glass ceilings and how tough politics is, and it's always been tough. I mean, it was never easy. It's just a different kind of tough now, but it was tough then. And for Ann Richards to break that glass ceiling in Texas and be elected. There'd been one other governor in Texas, but she wasn't elected. She was just the wife of a former governor that he just corruptly got into power. So to be a Democrat and to be a woman and to win in Texas, boy, you got to be tough as nails. And she was tough, and she was such a character. She was a great performer. An incredible performer. Man, when the lights went on, she was so good. So I'll tell you a quick story. So she loved the Texas Rangers, right? And the Texas Rangers are this mythic, but not just mythic, but it's a true organization. But there's mythic stories about them. And these are guys who all wear open road Stetsons, by the way. But there's only 100 of them at any time. And it started off back, a couple hundred years ago, and there was a riot down on the border, and they called for the Texas Rangers to come down. The train finally, the whole town's in a riot, and the train comes in, and one guy walks off, and the mayor says, "Well, where's all the rest of you?" And he turns to him and says, "One riot, one ranger." So that's kind of the ethos of the Texas Rangers. But Richards loved them because they all looked like Clint Eastwood, 6'4", just tough dudes. And so she used to, I remember her kind of walking through the convention with those guys surrounding her, and women would just kind of swoon as they'd walk by. But she was in a small airplane in the campaign and on the tarmac, and there was a bomb scare, a bomb threat. And so she had to sit out there for like 4 hours in like 100 degree heat, and it was baking in the plane. And she was in there and just sweated out and pitted out. And then you have to imagine her voice, which was epic, describing all this. And then she talks about how she's in the back of the plane in the dark, and then the plane door opens up and a like celestial shaft of life shines through, and in walks this again 6'4" ranger, bent over, takes off his hat, looks at her and says, "Afternoon, ma'am. My name's G.W. Hildebrand, Texas Ranger. I'm here to take you home and tuck you in." And, and she says her first thought was how she had dirty pantyhose hanging on the shower at home, and but that's typical Ann Richards, and she just was a great character. I knew her all her family really well. Cecile Richards who just passed away herself, sadly, was a great character too, and ran Planned Parenthood for years, and just a great Texas legendary character and family, and again, kind of a time past, but a legend for sure.
Mark, you did a piece in Vanity Fair the day after the election. It was a letter to your daughters, Britta and Kendall. And I'm just kind of interested because we've gone from Ann Richards to 2016, where, I was convinced Hillary Clinton was going to win. And then 2024, I thought Kamala Harris was going to win. And I've got a daughter that, in her 30s. And I just, I'm hopeful that, someday that, we'll have a female president, but we're not there yet. So what motivated you to pen this letter to your daughters?
Well, so we've all been around long enough that we know that the pendulum swings, and it does, and it will. And I believe there will be a woman president, and I think a well qualified woman candidate, all things being equal, will be much more appealing to the American electorate for lots of reasons than a typical male candidate. All things being equal, which they rarely are. But my youngest daughter that I mentioned earlier was with me in New York in 2016, and again, like you, everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. Of course, she did, and this was her first sort of political awakening. She had gotten interested and involved, and then just crushed by that disappointment. And I mean, literally couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. And I saw that. And then, it was just so sad then to see, young voters, especially young women, get so excited about that candidacy, and then to be, knocked back to again, whatever your politics are, she was a well-qualified candidate. So when Harris came around, it was like, okay, we got a second chance, and for me, again, I for all obvious reasons that we share, I thought she was, not only a good candidate, but well qualified and would be potentially a good president, and thought she was going to win, and as did my daughter and lots of other women, and so I of course was, I was disappointed. But I've been around 7 decades, and so I've seen this, and I know stuff bounces back, but they haven't. And so to get this 1-2 punch at first Clinton, then Harris, my greatest fear is that they would give up, and just give up on the idea of a better. A different, better world, and and the possibility that a woman could be in charge. And so that's what inspired the letter. And because, as badly as I felt, I knew there were a whole lot of people, including especially young women, that were hurting a lot worse than I was.
Well, there's been a real stratification with, in fact, you penned a piece on that too, about the magnification of young men, with the Joe Rogan, Charlie Kirk, a lot of young men have latched onto that, where, a lot of young women are kind of repulsed by it. How do we, it seems like nowadays that, the far right owns social media. They've beaten the mainstream media into submission. The big law firms are all bending over universities. How do we break through that barrier and be able to communicate that?
Well, I'm actually doing in the middle of making a documentary about Gen Z voters and the 2024 election. So hopefully by the time I'm done with this, I'll have some greater insights than I do right now. But I have some, and one is just that I think there's a legitimate critique of the Democratic Party in the sense that the three most important. I'm quoting my friend Paul Begala, Wheeler. I'm sure you know him. Who said the three most important words in the English language are not "I love you," it's "I hear you." And the Democratic Party, while boosting a lot of demographic groups appropriately, it's ignored young white men, and just didn't communicate with them, and they ultimately said, well, they're not listening to me. I'm going to find somebody who will and does. And the Republican Party and Charlie Kirk and others said, hey, we got a place for you over here. And so, it's about communicating, and it's about recognizing that, all people want to be heard. And but listen, I mean, there's a whole lot of psychology that goes into what's happening with young, men, particularly young white men in society, and their isolation and their loneliness, and just what's happening to them that's worthy of a podcast on its own. And as I said, hopefully our documentary will address that, but in some ways. But I'm I think that the best thing that happened, listen, I learned a lot more from losing campaigns than winning campaigns. When you losing campaigns is the worst feeling in the world. Winning's fun. It's a great feeling, but you don't ever want to feel that losing feeling again. And so that drives you to be better and smarter. And I think that when you spend time in the political desert, you learn to find water. And I think that's what's happening with Democrats now. I think they're getting smarter, and they're recognizing mistakes made in the last campaign. And I think that listen, I mean, I think it's going to be relatively easy, because I think the fundamental message will be, by the time these guys finish screwing things up so badly, the message will be not that, which will be pretty simple. But I also think that, also to get out of the desert, you need Moses. And so we don't know who that's going to be yet, but somebody's got to rise up and, become the personification of, what people are living and feeling and breathing and hoping. And but that's what politics is all about, and that's what primary processes are about. And we'll see what shakes out.
Yeah, James Carville has a op-ed in the New York Times today.
Saw
it. Where he describes Trump as a one-trick Shetland pony who makes big promises. Because remember, he promised that he would end the war in Ukraine before he ever took office, and inflation on day one, he was going to take care of that. And Carville's point in his op-ed was the Democrats just need to be quiet and let Trump be Trump. And when people start to feel the pain, then they'll get the message that
no need to catch a falling knife.
Right.
George Bush used to say, "Shoot low, they're riding Shetlands."
Well, hopefully, the Democrats have gotten the message. I mean, when you've got a 29% approval rating, you've got problems. I know right after the election, there's an article in The Hill where you were you were saying November was an ass kicking for the Democrats. So what gives you hope that we're going to find the path forward?
Well, just history is a big part of it, and also just how completely these guys are screwing it up. I mean, I won't go into all the specifics, but they inherited really, despite their disinformation campaign, a very decent economy that they didn't need to do much to they just needed to just keep it on cruise control, and it would have been a lot of good news for a lot of people. And they've screwed that up already, and it looks like it's going to get a lot worse. And I think that the important thing is to focus, pick your targets. That's what Carville's saying. Is, part of what they do is, they come up with this ridiculous shit like the third term, and a big part of that's just designed to make Democrats go crazy and get distracted. So Carville's just saying, that's not going to happen. Just ignore that shit and focus on the stuff that really matters to people. Like the economy's stupid, and his mantra is it was true then, it's true now. And the good news is that you're blessed by the opposition here. So get focused on an economic message, and just get the spring training going.
Right. Back in 2006, I was the chief prosecutor for the terrorism trials down at Guantanamo when the Supreme Court ruled that the military commissions that Bush had created were unlawful, that Congress had to get involved. And so I got to work with Lindsey Graham and John McCain on the legislation to, and I remember we were in Lindsey Graham's office, and I knew Lindsey from the Air Force, and I told him that my policy as chief prosecutor was we wouldn't use any evidence obtained by torture. And when McCain came in the room, he said, "Tell John what you told me." And so I repeated it. And McCain grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "I'm so glad to hear you say that. Now, what do you need to get the job done right?" And to me, it's amazing that, the two of them were the ones that kind of single-handedly pushed back against the Bush administration and a lot of the post 9/11 policies. And to see that Lindsey Graham from then to the Lindsey Graham we see now, it's like when John McCain left and when he died, that Lindsey Graham lost his moral compass. And
Yeah,
me,
well, again, thank you for serving. And I mean, that was heroic stuff from McCain back then. Just another great example. I mean, we miss his voice so terribly because there's just nobody with his kind of backbone anymore, especially Lindsey Graham, to see what's happened with him. Can I tell you a quick McCain story that's just kind of similar to yours?
Yeah.
So I always loved McCain, even during the 2000 campaign, and kind of back channeled with Weaver and the McCain folks, even during all that. And in 2004, they patched things up, and the third debate was in Arizona, the presidential debate, and McCain sponsored us. And so we got down there, and we're in the green room, and it's, there's 15 or 20 people all kind of roaming around, and McCain's doing his Angelo Dundee. "Yeah, you're going to get him, George. You're going to do great." And there's a television in the corner that has a news story about an NFL football player who played for the Denver Broncos, and he had sewn the number of a fallen comrade named Pat Tillman. And Pat Tillman was the famous NFL football player who left after 9/11, walked away from a $7 or $11 million salary, and volunteered to go to Afghanistan, and then was killed tragically in friendly fire. And so the news story was about how the NFL commissioner was like fining this guy for honoring his fallen comrade because it was a violation of NFL uniform rules to have anything else on your uniform. And then it cut to McCain in this news story, just putting that guy through an acid bath in typical McCain style. So I went up to McCain, who I didn't really know that well at this point, and I said, "Senator, I just saw this news story with you, and I just want to tell you how much I appreciate what you said, but I also wanted to say, that I too feel very strongly about Pat Tillman, so strongly that when it happened, there was a Sports Illustrated cover story about him that said, 'Never forget this man.'" And I really took that to heart. And I said, well, how can I make sure I don't forget him? And so I went and got the one and only tattoo that I've ever gotten on my arm of the same thing that the NFL guy done, and tattooed the number 40 on my shoulder, which most people think it was just a drunk 40th birthday. But then McCain says, "Oh, bullshit, McKinnon," and he makes me strip down in the green room, like take off my clothes, and I show him. And when he sees the tattoo, he teared up and then hugged me and he said, "McKinnon, I knew there was a reason I liked you."
Yeah.
That was kind of our bonding moment.
That's cool. That's awesome. So let's jump forward to 2028.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
Who on the Democratic side should folks like Mo and myself and our listeners keep an eye on? And then maybe a couple folks on the Republican side that you think could get this country back to where the three of us could actually get a decent night's sleep.
Well, like I said, it's got to be Moses. And it could very well be somebody that we haven't seen before, or that's not on the list right now. And given people's sort of feelings about both parties these days, I keep that slot open for somebody that maybe is not a, they're talking about Stephen Smith running for president, which I think is a little nuts, but that's the kind of world we live in right now. I mean, look at Gen Z and their feelings about both parties and the rising number of independents. So, somebody who's not a typical party person. I mean, the typical ones would be Josh Shapiro or Gretchen Whitmer. Cory Booker kind of raised his stakes again with that great speech. And, so I think I like a Midwestern governor. I guess, I'm a big fan of Whitmer's, although I guess she did herself some damage the other day. So I like Midwestern governors, but again, I think, I'd love to see, maybe it's a Mark Cuban or somebody from the private sector. I have no idea. I don't know who's left in the Republican Party that considers themselves a Republican now that's, in decent graces with MAGA I want to bring back Mitt Romney or, anybody. I don't know the Republican Party's in such shambles. I can't even think of anybody who's like, a member there in good standing or even in standing anymore that considers themselves a Republican, that could, Nikki Haley, I don't know. The thing is, if it melts down, it's going to take a long time because I think there's going to be a core, no matter how badly things may go here in the short term, I think MAGA is probably around for the long term. And just in the sense that there's going to be a 30% of that base that will never take any accountability, will never blame Trump, will blame the media, will blame Democrats. It's just victimhood. So, and I think it's going to take a meltdown to ever restore any sanity to that party. So I hope it melts down. I hope that, it's probably going to be J.D. Vance or, somebody of that ilk. And I trying to carry that MAGA torch. And I just think it's going to take a while for that torch to go out. So I think it's going to be for those reasons and all the calamity and chaos that's going to happen. I think it's going to be a really great opportunity for Democrats to swing this pendulum back.
Or for Democrats to almost win and then fuck it up completely again. So,
yes.
What about Mark Cuban? I know he's a fellow Texan, and we've had some talks with him in the past. What are your thoughts about Mark?
I'm a fan. I think, he's the kind of guy that's got big ideas, got a ton of money. He's the kind of guy that I think he's exactly the sort of private sector guy who, would come with good private sector ideas and, good, business friendly approach, but believes in sort of, big D and small D democratic principles. So I think I'd put him on the list for sure.
Yeah, no, I think he's terrific. He's smart. He doesn't seem to have the asshole gene. Now,
Yeah.
He may beg to differ on that, and maybe his wife does too. But
you got to have a little bit of it to get
yeah, exactly.
Crappy. You have to have kind of a give a shit gene.
Yeah. All right. Well, so Mark, just one more quick question, and then we'll wrap this up so you can get back out on your horse or your Shetland. And so what gets you up in the morning, my friend? I mean, obviously, our listeners hear a lot of gloom and doom, and the market's going all over the place, and Trump's making up shit, and really, if I ever get the chance to see or talk to that guy, the one question I'd like to ask him is, do you have any idea the effect what you do and says on other people?
Well, the answer is it's clearly no, and he doesn't give a shit.
No, he just doesn't give a shit.
That's what I'm talking about, that empathy. Yeah. It's all about it, always has been. You know what gets me up, guys, is no matter how chaotic and gloomy things may look out there, I feel incredibly blessed, incredibly lucky. I have a gratitude list I think about every day, and for all the things that are wrong, I think about the things that are right. And I have I'm surrounded by grandkids and family, and I live in Colorado where I grew up, and I love it. And I would leave you with this thought that I was reminded of recently. Albert Einstein said that believe that either everything's a miracle or nothing's a miracle. And so Einstein chose to believe that everything's a miracle. And I'm kind of in that camp. I'm in the miracle camp. I think life's a miracle. And again, I'm a prisoner of hope. And I know the cell's dark, but the flame's still shining.
Well, that's a perfect place for us to end this. So that'll be a wrap for Muck U, where the mud flies and the phonies fry, which Mark McKinnon is certainly not one of them. I'm David Wheeler, the ringmaster of this Muck Fest, alongside Colonel Mo Davis, who's tougher than a sovereign oak and twice as rooted. Grab Mo's book on Amazon.com if you've got taste. Again, that's Sovereign Oak. Thank you again to our guest today, the inimitable, I'll get it right someday, Mark McKinnon. Read his latest article on VanityFair.com. We'll catch you next time when we rake it up again. Until then, Muck U.
This has been Muck U, co-hosted by Colonel Mo Davis in Asheville, North Carolina, and David Wheeler in Spruce Pine, North Carolina. Thanks to our guest today, Mark McKinnon. You can read Mark's latest article about the Bush campaign reunion on VanityFair.com. Muck U is produced by American Muckrakers, copyright 2025. You can learn more and donate at AmericanMuckrakers.com. Follow us on Blue Sky under American.Muckrakers. David and Mo hope y'all come back soon for a new episode.